On a dark winter morning in January of 1943, long before the sun rose over the Greenland ice cap, two British intelligence officers prepared for a mission few people on the base even knew existed. The outpost they were stationed at wasn't much more than a cluster of prefabricated huts and a small airstrip carved into frozen gravel. Everything around them was white, silent, and violent all at once. Temperatures dropped low enough to freeze exposed skin in seconds, and the wind came howling down from the polar plateau like it carried its own agenda. Yet this was where the Allies had placed some of their most secret reconnaissance flights, because from here, the Arctic opened in all directions, hiding German operations that standard patrols would never see. The aircraft waiting for them that morning was a compact British-built reconnaissance plane, the kind designed to fly low, fast, and quiet. Its wings were frosted over before dawn, and mechanics scraped the ice under small lanterns because the electricity was unreliable that week. The two officers, men in their early 30s who had already spent years working in intelligence, moved with a restrained calm as they loaded the last of their equipment. They carried nothing that identified their real roles. No badges. No documents, just heavy wool uniforms, gloved hands, and the quiet focus of men who had done this many times before. Their orders were simple on paper but dangerous in execution. Fly a straight path along Greenland's eastern coast, photograph suspected German weather stations, and return before nightfall. The weather stations were small, hidden, and critical. Whoever controlled Arctic forecasts held enormous tactical power in the North Atlantic, where Allied convoys fought to survive each week. The Germans had been slipping secret teams onto the ice for years. Some stations were disguised as abandoned huts or fishing shacks. Others were buried beneath snow with only an antenna showing. Finding them meant tilting the war ever so slightly back in the Allies' favor. Just after 700 hours, the pilot throttled the engine, and the aircraft lifted off the frozen strip, its wheels kicking up a wave of powder. For a moment the plane looked like a dark insect swallowed by the endless white. Then it vanished into the low Arctic cloud cover. The men left behind on the base watched it disappear, knowing they might not see it again for 12 hours. Winter flights in this region were always risky. Storms formed without warning, and navigation tools froze easily. But the crew had done this route before. Each time they returned with more photographs, more evidence of Germany's expansion north, more proof the war wasn't confined to the rest of the world. It was creeping across the poles as well. For several hours, everything went as expected. Routine check-ins came across the radio at planned intervals. The pilot kept his tone neutral, almost bored, which for a spy mission was a good sign. It meant no unusual sightings, no German interference, no signs of trouble. But then, sometime past midday, the responses grew irregular. A short delay here, a bit of static there, nothing alarming at first. Arctic conditions often bent radio waves in odd ways, and winter storms could garble transmissions long before they arrived. Still, the base operator logged each irregularity. Procedure demanded it, and he'd been trained never to assume a glitch was just the weather. Then the storm hit. It came sweeping in from the north so quickly that the weather balloons didn't even track it. Wind speeds nearly doubled in under 20 minutes. The sky collapsed into gray. Snow lashed the base sideways. Visibility dropped so low the floodlights produced nothing but a faint white haze. The men at the outpost knew the plane was somewhere inside that chaos, and even from the ground, the storm sounded like something that could tear metal apart. By mid-afternoon, the radio went silent. Operators tried every frequency, switching through coded channels the intelligence officers carried. They waited. They listened. They repeated the call sign over and over until their voices cracked. Nothing came back. Hours passed. The storm didn't let up. Rescue plans were drafted but halted. The wind made flight impossible. On the ground, small teams gathered thermal gear and basic medical supplies, preparing to depart on foot if the weather broke. Nobody said it aloud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. If the crew went down out there, their chances were nearly zero. Late that evening, when the wind dropped enough to hear again, the radio crackled. At first it sounded like more static. Then a faint voice pushed through, broken and barely recognizable. The operator froze and leaned in. It was the pilot. The transmission was slurred by interference, chopped by distance, but one line came through clearly. So clear the operator later said it felt like someone whispering directly behind him. Descending not by choice. Then the signal vanished. Search crews were deployed the next morning, fighting their way into the storm's aftermath. They moved across shifting snowfields where even footsteps disappeared within minutes. The Arctic was not a place that welcomed mistakes. It swallowed them. They looked for smoke, debris, anything that could point toward a downed aircraft. What they found instead were scattered traces of radio static that didn't lead anywhere. It was like chasing ghosts. Days passed. The search area widened until rescue teams had to rotate every 6 hours to avoid frostbite. No wreckage, no sign of emergency flares, no footprints, no parachute marks, just rolling ice and the distant crash of shifting glaciers. On the 5th day, the military called off the search. The official reason was weather danger, equipment fatigue, and low survival probability. But the unofficial conversations on the base painted a different story. Many felt the plane had been forced out of the sky. No one forgets a message like, "Not by choice." Some speculated mechanical failure. Others whispered the Germans had advanced anti-air capabilities in the region that the Allies didn't yet understand. A few pointed toward sabotage, recalling a mechanic who had warned them earlier that week about a persistent rattle in the engine that never seemed to go away despite multiple checks. The leadership moved quickly. All logs from the mission were collected and locked away. The final transmission was marked classified. The 2 officers were declared missing, presumed dead, though the wording in the paperwork was suspiciously vague. Within days, the military wrapped the incident in a level of secrecy that exceeded normal reconnaissance losses. Even their fellow servicemen weren't given the full story. The mission was labeled an operational anomaly, and no one was allowed to discuss it further. Families received letters that felt strangely impersonal, as if written by someone who didn't actually know what happened. The pilot's wife in London opened a note that simply said he had not returned from active duty. The intelligence officer's parents in Manchester were told their son's aircraft encountered unforeseen complications. No details, no explanations, no mention of the last broadcast or the storm or the frantic search. Just a quiet suggestion that they accept the loss and move on, even though the truth had been sealed behind locked doors thousands of miles away. Back at the frozen outpost, rumors continued long after official investigations ended. Some crews were convinced the plane had been intercepted by a German weather team. Others wondered if it had flown too low over a hidden base and been shot down. A few believed the storm itself wasn't natural. Arctic weather could behave unpredictably, but the timing was too perfect, too sudden. And then there were the darker theories, whispered at night over weak tea and smoldering cigarettes. That someone at the base had tampered with the aircraft, that the mission had been compromised before it even left the ground, that those 2 men had stepped into a death trap without knowing it. Whatever happened, the plane's disappearance settled into Allied history as one of the war's coldest mysteries. A last transmission trapped in the ice, an aircraft that vanished without a trail, a case stamped and locked so deeply in classified archives that even decades later, researchers looking for answers hit walls of redacted pages and missing files. And as the war moved on, as new battles erupted across Europe, the story faded from public memory, surviving only as a brief rumor among soldiers who had served on that lonely Arctic outpost. For most people, the story ended there, just another wartime incident swallowed by the chaos of global conflict. But time has a strange way of preserving what the world forgets. The Arctic does too. Beneath millions of tons of ice, the truth stayed frozen, untouched, waiting for a moment almost no one thought would ever come. Because while the military buried the documents and families buried their grief, The wreckage of that aircraft remained somewhere out on the glacier, drifting slowly with the moving ice, quietly waiting to be found. Nearly 8 decades passed before anything about the mission resurfaced. The war ended, the world moved on, and the Arctic swallowed its secrets. But secrecy doesn't last forever. Governments shift, archivists retire, and locked rooms eventually open. In 2021, during a routine review of Cold War files being digitized, a small set of World War II intelligence folders unexpectedly appeared in a batch meant for declassification. No one realized the significance at first. They were thin, incomplete, and tucked between hundreds of other wartime documents, but the title stamped on one of them caught the eye of a historian working the night shift: Operation Frostlight. It was a name almost nobody had ever heard. Inside the folder, the pages looked worn, as if handled many times and then forgotten. Some were typed reports, some handwritten notes, and others were just fragments. But the moment researchers began reading, inconsistencies surfaced like cracks in old ice. The documents didn't agree on basic facts, starting with the plane's final known position. One report stated it was last tracked turning west, toward the inland plateau. Another claimed it veered east, toward the ocean. Both reports came from the same week, supposedly from the same radar team. Neither was marked as a correction. Both were presented as official. To historians, contradictions like that didn't signal simple clerical errors. They suggested something far more deliberate. As researchers dug deeper, the inconsistencies multiplied. Flight logs cut off mid-entry, weather records missing entire sections, technical assessments where half the page had been struck through with thick black ink. Even the mission briefing, the document that normally outlined objectives, weather predictions, and expected return routes, contained an unexplained blank space, like someone had physically removed a paragraph before copying it. For a mission this simple, this routine, the documentation felt strangely chaotic, too chaotic. Word of the discovery spread quietly among academics who specialized in wartime intelligence. A small group of them began cross-referencing the Frostlight files with other archived records, communication logs, unit diaries, mechanical reports from the outpost. The deeper they went, the stranger the case became. It was as if the disappearance had been recorded multiple times by different people, each one telling a slightly different story. Some entries suggested heavy storm activity. Others didn't mention weather at all. One log claimed the final radio transmission came in at 1600 hours. Another listed it at 1730. And the most curious detail of all, a reference to supplementary equipment loaded onto the aircraft, without specifying what it was or why it was needed. That line alone turned the mission from a simple reconnaissance flight into a puzzle. Historians started interviewing anyone still alive who had worked on Arctic operations during the war. Most were in their 90s. Some barely remembered the missions they supported. But then there was the mechanic's grandson. He contacted a researcher after hearing about the declassified folder on a radio program. His grandfather had served at the Greenland outpost in 1943, and before he died, he had repeatedly told a story the family always assumed was just the ramblings of old age. He said he once worked on a reconnaissance plane that carried camera equipment heavier than anything I'd ever seen, and that the officers who flew it didn't treat it like a camera at all. They guarded it. They refused to let mechanics open its housing. They closed the hangar doors during loading. And the morning of the flight, his grandfather remembered something else, an argument between two officers about weight distribution, about whether they were over the limit for Arctic takeoff. For nearly 80 years, his grandfather feared sharing that publicly. He told only his family. But now, as the grandson spoke, researchers realized the story matched the timeline of the Frostlight mission exactly. And for the first time, someone outside the military was saying it outright. The aircraft wasn't carrying standard reconnaissance equipment. It was carrying something classified. The grandson's testimony reopened questions historians had mostly avoided. Why would intelligence officers risk overloading a small aircraft in Arctic winter? Why bring unusually heavy equipment without coordinating the mission logs? And why was that equipment omitted entirely from the flight manifest? Even in wartime, armies documented their gear meticulously. The absence wasn't an oversight, it was intentional. Then came another breakthrough. A retired radio operator in his late 90s, living in a care facility in Scotland, agreed to speak when contacted by a university researcher. He had been stationed at a different Arctic post during the same period. Though frail, his memory of that winter was astonishingly sharp, and when asked about distress signals, he hesitated before admitting something he had never previously shared. He said he had intercepted a brief, faint beacon on the night the Frostlight plane vanished. It was so weak he wasn't sure at first if it was genuine. The signal repeated twice, then cut out. It didn't match Allied emergency codes, so the officer on duty dismissed it. But the old man swore he recognized a pattern, an improvised form of Morse often used when standard transmitters malfunctioned. He had tried to report it, but his commanding officer told him, "We're not logging anomalies tonight," and ordered him to clear the channel. That moment haunted him for decades. He always wondered, deep down, if what he heard was the missing plane's final attempt to call for help. When historians attempted to verify the operator's story, they found something disturbing. Radio logs from that exact night were missing. Not misplaced, not damaged, gone. The binder jumped from the day before to the day after with no transition. Every other week from that winter was intact. Only the night of the disappearance contained a void. The contradictions were no longer small clerical issues. They had become a pattern. But the most emotional revelations came from the families of the two men aboard the plane. For most of their lives, they believed the official version: a storm, a missing aircraft, a tragedy lost to time. They had lived with grief, then acceptance, then the quiet resignation that comes after realizing the answers will never come. But now, with historians digging and documents resurfacing, their memories sharpened painfully. The pilot's daughter, born a few months after he vanished, spoke publicly for the first time. She had grown up with a father she never knew, relying instead on stories told by relatives. She remembered a detail her mother had shared, a sense that the military withheld something. Her mother had once shown her a letter stamped "confidential," addressed to her father, written only 2 days before his last flight. The letter was destroyed in a house fire decades later, but her mother always believed it held orders related to the mission. She remembered her mother insisting the disappearance wasn't natural, and that someone decided long before that flight took off how it was going to end. Meanwhile, the intelligence officer's surviving sister, now in her late 80s, said the military sent a second letter weeks after the original notification, this time asking her family to refrain from discussing the mission with journalists or academics. She couldn't understand why. How could a routine reconnaissance flight require that kind of silence? She remembered her father growing frustrated and writing back, demanding more information. No one ever responded. The family's testimonies turned the Frostlight disappearance into something bigger than a wartime loss. It became a story of generations living in the shadow of an unanswered question. These weren't families who sought attention. They had stayed quiet for almost 80 years. Their decision to speak now wasn't about fame. It was about the sudden possibility that someone, somewhere, had always known more. As journalists joined the researchers, more gaps appeared in the official narrative. A flight engineer's diary mentioned an unusually heavy inspection crew at the outpost the day before the mission. A weather officer stationed nearby claimed he was ordered to stop sending forecasts for a 6-hour window the morning of the flight. None of these details appeared in the official reports, but they existed as fragments, small, personal records the military never controlled. And then there was one final inconsistency researchers found buried in a supplementary file. The original disappearance report had been rewritten 3 times. The first version was blunt, referencing mechanical concerns noted by the ground team. The second shifted blame toward weather conditions, even though meteorological logs didn't support that narrative. The third, the one placed in the formal archive, was strangely neutral, providing minimal detail and avoiding definitive statements. Each rewrite removed information instead of adding it. It was the opposite of proper documentation. By now, the Frostlight mission no longer resembled a tragic accident. It looked like an unfinished story pieced together from conflicting voices, some factual, some concealed, some forgotten, some deliberately erased. And behind every contradiction was one unspoken question. What was that aircraft truly carrying, and why had so much effort gone into burying its tracks? Researchers couldn't answer it yet, but they were finally asking the right things. And out on the vast, frozen landscape where the plane vanished, untouched for nearly 80 years, the Arctic was still holding onto the only piece of evidence that could connect everything together. Ice remembers what people forget, and soon, someone would stumble upon something buried too deep, too long, and too cold to have surfaced by chance. For most people, Eastern Greenland is a place that exists only on maps, a stretch of frozen emptiness, jagged peaks, and shifting blue ice that swallows anything unlucky enough to fall into it. But to a small group of experienced hikers and explorers, it's a place of quiet beauty, harsh, unpredictable but strangely magnetic. In the summer of 2022, when sunlight stretched for nearly 20 hours a day and temperatures rose just enough to soften the top layer of snow, a Danish hiker named Erik Langen set out alone to traverse one of the most isolated glacier shelves on the coast. He had been there before. He knew the winds, the cracks that opened without warning, the silence that made him feel small. He carried only what he needed: a satellite phone, crampons, a GPS unit, and a camera he kept wrapped in cloth to protect it from the cold. On the third day of his trek, he moved across a stretch of ice that looked no different from the miles behind him, smooth, pale, glistening under the low sun. The air was still. No birds, no aircraft, just the crunch of his own boots and the occasional echo of distant ice shifting under layers older than any human memory. It was the kind of terrain where nothing man-made should exist. So when he caught sight of a small metallic edge poking out of the ice, he assumed it was trash left by another expedition, maybe a cooking pot or an old climbing spike. But as he drew closer, the sun caught its surface in a way that made him slow down. It wasn't new metal. The edges were weathered, softened by time. He knelt, brushing away loose snow, and the moment he uncovered a curved panel bolted to a larger structure beneath the ice, a strange unease settled in his stomach. Metal that old shouldn't be here. Not on this glacier. Not in a place untouched by human traffic. He cleared more snow. Another piece of the buried object emerged, a rounded contour, the faint trace of a painted emblem almost invisible under frost. He leaned closer, rubbing the ice with his glove until the colors beneath came into focus. A faded circle, a ring of red, white, and blue. He froze. Most people wouldn't recognize it instantly, but Erik had spent years reading history books on polar expeditions and wartime operations, and he knew exactly what he was looking at: the RAF roundel, the insignia used by British aircraft during World War II. He stared at it, unable to process the scale of what he had found. He remembered stories about a missing plane from the 1940s, something that had vanished without trace in the Arctic. He had always dismissed them as rumor, another wartime mystery swallowed by nature. Yet here it was, right beneath his hands. A chill spread through him that had nothing to do with the cold. He stepped back, suddenly aware of how alone he was, how silent the glacier had become, as if the discovery itself had changed the air around him. He forced himself to move carefully, scanning the ice for more clues. The metal edge was only the beginning. A few meters downslope, deeper in the blue ice, a curved shape caught the light. As he approached, he realized he was looking at a section of fuselage, preserved perfectly enough that rivets were still visible. Beyond it, a vertical shape rose within the ice, something long, rigid, with the silhouette of a broken wing trapped inside a frozen tomb. Eric felt a strange mix of awe and dread. He had stumbled onto something that shouldn't exist, something history had already declared lost. He approached the cockpit, or what looked like the outline of one. The forward windows were cracked, their edges obscured by white frost, but through the glass, through almost 8 decades of ice, he could still see shapes inside, instruments, levers, the faint outline of a navigator's station. Everything was suspended in time, as if the crash hadn't happened in 1943 but only yesterday, and the cold had preserved it long enough for someone to finally come looking. Except no one had been looking, not anymore. Eric raised his camera with shaking hands. He wasn't a journalist or a researcher, but he knew no one would believe him without proof. He took wide shots, close shots, images of the roundel, the wing, the cockpit, even the jagged ice patterns that had formed over decades. He marked the GPS coordinates with trembling fingers and entered them twice, afraid the device might malfunction from the cold. Standing there, he felt the weight of the moment settle over him. This wasn't just wreckage, it was a grave. No bodies were visible, the ice was too thick, but he knew the 2 men who had flown this plane had once sat exactly where he was looking. Their last moments were likely spent inside that cockpit, fighting the cold, the wind, and whatever forced them out of the sky. The thought made his stomach tighten. The wind picked up slightly as he backed away from the site, almost as if the glacier wanted to reclaim what it had shown him. His instincts told him to leave, not from fear, but from a sudden sense that this discovery didn't belong to him. It belonged to the world, and to the families who had waited decades for answers. He turned and began the long trek back toward the coastline. The weight on his shoulders felt heavier with each step, even though he carried nothing more than before. He kept glancing back, half expecting the wreck to disappear behind him like a mirage. But the metal glinted faintly under the sun, anchored firmly in the ice. A reminder that this wasn't imagination, it was real. Hours later, when he finally reached a satellite signal strong enough to send images, he hesitated. The world he lived in wasn't the same one that sent men out in fragile planes into Arctic storms, and he knew releasing this would ignite something unpredictable: curiosity, debate, maybe even conflict over who had rights to the site. But he also knew he couldn't keep it to himself, not when families had gone generations without closure. He sent the photos to a friend who worked in Copenhagen's small aviation museum, attaching only a brief note. "Found this today. Need confirmation. Call me." He didn't expect what happened next. The friend responded within minutes with a single message: "Where are you? Do not leave the area. More coming." Over the next 12 hours, the images spread across private groups of historians, military archivists, and aviation experts. By the next morning, they reached journalists who specialized in undiscovered wrecks and wartime mysteries. The reaction was immediate. Every expert recognized the aircraft type. Every historian recognized the insignia. And all of them said the same thing. There was no record, no log, no account of any British plane being found in that region, not during the war and not in the 79 years that followed. That realization alone made Eric's discovery more than remarkable. It made it historic. Within days, researchers pinpointed the likely identity of the aircraft. The RAF had sent several reconnaissance flights over Greenland in 1943, but only one had vanished without a trace. The coordinates Eric provided matched what historians estimated could have been the plane's altered flight path, one that had been debated for decades but never confirmed. The discovery wasn't just proof of the mission. It was evidence that every search team in the 1940s had been looking in the wrong place. Online discussion exploded. Aviation forums lit up with theories. Some speculated that the plane had glided onto the glacier instead of crashing. Others suggested the ice had moved significantly over the decades, carrying the wreckage away from its original impact site. A few whispered darker theories: sabotage, interception, or deliberate misdirection by military officials who didn't want the plane found. But for the families of the missing men, the discovery meant something simpler and more painful. The story they had carried for a lifetime was real. They finally had proof that the plane existed, that it had landed on the ice, that their loved ones were not lost to the sea or vanished without a trace. And while they didn't yet know what happened inside that cockpit, they knew the world was paying attention. As Eric made his way back to the nearest settlement, he received messages from people he had never met, government officials, journalists, historians, even military staff. Some asked for interviews. Others demanded he return to the site. But he ignored all of them except one, a researcher from Britain who said simply, "Thank you for giving us back a piece of them." By the end of the week, international teams were already preparing to reach the coordinates. And although Eric had no idea what they would uncover once they chipped away the rest of the ice, he felt certain that whatever lay inside that frozen cockpit, the instruments, the flight logs, the damage, would reshape everything historians thought they knew about the plane's final hours. The mystery that had faded into silence almost 80 years earlier was alive again, and the glacier that had hidden its secret for generations was finally giving it up, piece by piece, like a story thawing in slow motion. When the rescue teams arrive on the glacier, the air feels painfully thin, as if the cold itself is trying to erase any trace of what happened here. The wreck sits half buried in blue ice, tilted slightly as if still fighting for altitude. Years of winter storms have polished its metal skin to a dull shine, but the aircraft's shape is unmistakable. It looks less like debris and more like something caught mid-fall, frozen before impact could finish its job. For almost 80 years, the glacier has protected it like a secret it wasn't ready to give up. The first specialists approach slowly, not out of fear but reverence. They begin chipping away the ice with small hand tools, no loud machines, no sudden movements. The cold clang of the picks echoes against the cliffs, each strike revealing a little more of the past. When they clear around the cockpit, the details feel almost too intimate. The pilot's seatbelt is still fastened, cinched tight across a cushion flattened by time but not decay. The metal buckles are tarnished but locked. It's as if someone stepped out only moments ago. Behind the control panel, the gauges are suspended in positions that make no mechanical sense for a crash. The altitude needle points upward. The fuel indicator seems to show half a tank. The airspeed dial is frozen mid-swing. A historian kneels in front of the cockpit window, wiping frost from the glass with a gloved hand, and whispers that he has never seen a wreck where the instruments seem to be climbing in the seconds before impact. It's as though the plane tried to pull itself out of disaster long after the pilot could have reacted. Farther back in the fuselage, they uncover a crate bolted to the wall, sealed shut under a thick layer of ice. The box is heavy, reinforced with metal edges and stenciled markings almost invisible beneath the frost. When they finally pry it free and wipe away the exterior, someone breathes the words that change the entire investigation: camera housing. The kind used for reconnaissance missions, but heavier, more reinforced, built to protect film even under catastrophic force. It is exactly the kind of equipment rumored in declassified files. Heavier than anything standard, experimental, built for something important enough to keep secret for generations. But there's one detail that hits everyone harder than the technology or the eerie condition of the instruments. There are no remains, no bones, no torn fabric, no boots, no personal items that might hint at where the pilot or intelligence officers ended up. The seats are empty. The floor is clean. The cockpit doors are latched from the inside. If they survived the impact, they would have had to climb out on their own, pushing against winds cold enough to strike a person unconscious in minutes. The search area has been combed before, long ago, yet nothing was ever found. Snow scientists on the team explain what might have happened. According to them, the aircraft didn't crash here in 1943. The glacier moved. It advanced downhill by meters every year, carrying the wreck with it like something slowly drifting through time. If the men survived and walked away, the place where they set foot on the ice could be miles from where the plane rests now. And if they didn't survive, the glacier may have swallowed them long before anyone ever thought to look. While the forensic teams work the interior, engine experts gather around the exposed right side of the aircraft. The cowling has torn open from the slide, revealing the engine block. At first, it seems identical to standard RAF reconnaissance engines of the era, but then they notice the marks, subtle, deliberate, undeniable. Scratches around key bolts where tools had been used, not by a mechanic following protocol, but by someone making hurried, irregular adjustments. A section of wiring to the magneto is frayed and rewrapped with a material that doesn't match the rest of the plane. A screw is missing entirely from the ignition housing. When they pull the logs, the mechanic who last inspected the aircraft is long dead, but his report, discovered during the earlier document releases, stated the plane was functioning within expected parameters. The forensic engineers disagree. Someone tampered with the ignition system before the plane ever left the outpost. It wouldn't have caused immediate failure. That's what makes it dangerous. Instead, it would trigger a delayed malfunction once the aircraft hit a certain altitude or endured enough cold exposure. The idea sends a chill through the team that has nothing to do with the wind. Sabotage now feels far more plausible than rumor. As they document each detail, a separate team carefully transports the sealed camera container back to a temporary field lab. Everyone expects the film to be ruined. After nearly 8 decades trapped under ice, moisture should have seeped in long ago, destroying the emulsion. But when the technicians open the metal box inside a controlled tent, they find something astonishing. The inner chamber is bone dry. A thick seal, far sturdier than 1940s equipment typically used, has kept the chamber airtight. The reel of film inside is stiff from the cold but intact. Developing it requires slow warming, chemical calibration, and a level of caution no one thought they'd ever use on a reconnaissance reel from the Second World War. The images appear one frame at a time under red light. At first, they show nothing unusual: stretches of barren ice, distant mountain ridges, the shadow of the aircraft passing over blinding white terrain. Then something shifts. A new sequence of frames appears with shapes that aren't natural, thin vertical lines, angles too clean, too geometric. The historian leans in so close his breath fogs the glass. On the horizon, faint at first but unmistakable, stand structures. Not Allied, not Inuit, not temporary supply caches. They appear rectangular, metallic, and arranged in a cluster. Some are connected by what looks like a long cable or pipe. On the next frame, a pair of tall antenna-like towers rise above the snow. The archivist developing the film stops, looks at the historian, and says the words no one expected to say aloud. "This looks German." The images on the subsequent frames confirm it. On one of the structures, barely visible but distinct enough for anyone familiar with wartime symbology, lies a dark shape, a cross, not the medical one, the iron one. The film is proof of something historians suspected but never fully confirmed. Germany had deeper, more fortified weather or intelligence stations in eastern Greenland than the Allies publicly acknowledged. And if the reconnaissance officers photographed them, someone might have wanted that film never to return. The implications begin to echo across the ice field. If the officers captured something strategically devastating, sabotage becomes not just possible but likely. The missing screw, the manipulated ignition wiring, the conflicting final transmissions, all of it fits into a picture no one had the authority to draw back in 1943. Back then, secrecy was a priority. Losing 2 men and a small aircraft in exchange for protecting the existence of a German Arctic presence would have been considered a necessary silence. Meanwhile, searchers continue exploring the snow around the crash site. They map the glacier's historical movement, trying to determine where the aircraft originated from. By comparing satellite data and geological records, they estimate the original crash point is nearly 7 kilometers to the west, higher in the mountains. That area, still unreachable due to active ice fissures, may contain clues the glacier hasn't yet released. As night falls, the investigation camp glows like a small constellation on the ice. Experts sit around tables reviewing old mission logs, trying to understand why the plane flew into weather it never should have entered. The final transmission, descending, not by choice, returns to everyone's mind. If the ignition was sabotaged, the pilot may have lost power gradually, possibly believing he could still make an emergency landing. But the fact that the gauges froze mid-climb contradicts that. According to one historian, it's possible the instruments malfunctioned in the final moments, giving the pilot false readings while the aircraft was actually plummeting. But another expert argues something different. The gauges could have frozen in those positions after the crash, locked not at the moment of impact but during the long freeze afterward. The plane might have slid down the glacier at an angle that forced the dials to shift, then freeze during a later winter. In a way, the wreck has lived multiple lives, frozen over and thawed, shifted and refrozen, each cycle erasing or distorting the evidence. Still, the biggest question remains: where are the men? If they climbed out, they might have walked toward the mountain seeking shelter. If they stayed inside, hypothermia could have taken them within minutes. But in both scenarios, the glacier should have preserved something. The complete lack of remains troubles the investigators more than anything else. Then a field geologist shares a theory that casts a darker shadow over the site. If the men escaped but were injured or disoriented, they may have headed toward what they believed was higher ground, but was actually toward a crevasse field. The glacier near the estimated crash origin is riddled with hidden drop-offs, cracks that open in summer and hide under snow in winter. A person could fall dozens of meters into a narrow icy chute, beyond search visibility. Over 70 years, shifting ice would crush, distort, and bury anything inside. It's a theory no one wants to accept, but it's also one of the few that makes sense. Inside the tent, the last frames of the developed film spark a final shock. The aircraft's shadow appears again, but this time it's curved strangely, distorted across uneven terrain. And just beyond that shadow rises another structure in the snow, larger than the others, partially buried, its shape angular and fortified. It appears to have blast shielding. No known German weather station in Greenland ever documented such construction. Whatever the officers saw, it wasn't just a small outpost. It was something built to last. As the investigation team stands under the dim light of the field lamps, staring at the printed images lined up on the table, a heavy silence fills the room. The camera, preserved by ice for nearly 80 years, has become a witness, revealing a piece of history that governments chose not to acknowledge, a discovery the missing officers never lived to talk about. None of them know yet that the next stage of the investigation, triggered by these photographs, will reveal something even more unsettling. Not just what the officers saw, but what might still be hidden beneath the ice. And as the Arctic night settles across the glacier, that feeling grows that the truth is only halfway uncovered, and the ice has been guarding more than just a wreck. In the days after the frozen camera film is developed, historians and intelligence experts begin feeding the newly uncovered images into digital analysis software. The landscapes match nothing they've seen in Allied archives, but the angular structures on the horizon hold the unmistakable geometry of mid-war German construction. At first, it seems impossible. The east coast of Greenland was hostile, remote, nearly inaccessible even in summer. But then one historian pulls up a faded, cracked Kriegsmarine map logged in Berlin shortly before the war ended. He sets it on the table beside the printed spy photos. The room grows still. The shapes line up. The long rectangular building, the antenna towers, even the slope of the ridge in the background is nearly identical. The map lists the site under a coded designation, not one of the known weather stations Germany admitted to operating after the war. This one sits far deeper in the ice, hidden inside terrain so inhospitable the Allies never thoroughly searched it. The map marks it with a symbol rarely used outside of major operations, a black square with a diagonal line through it. The historian explains, quietly, that the symbol means restricted signals operation. It wasn't just a weather station, it was a communications hub. When this realization spreads among the analysts, a chilling new understanding forms. The reconnaissance flight that vanished in 1943 had flown directly over a covert German outpost designed to track, intercept, and possibly manipulate Allied transmissions. If the men aboard the plane photographed it, and the film proves they did, they had unintentionally documented one of the most sensitive installations in the Arctic War theater. Suddenly, the strange details from the original disappearance begin lining up. The conflicting directions of the plane's last turn, the sudden loss of radio, the cryptic final message, descending, not by choice. The wreck's eerie condition and the sabotage marks around the engine ignition system now take on an unsettling coherence. A retired intelligence analyst, flown to the investigation site after reviewing the new files, studies the engine photographs and the camera footage for hours. When he finally speaks, his explanation is blunt. The kind of tampering found on the ignition system, the missing screw, the frayed wiring, the irregular tool marks, is consistent with a mechanical interference device. Not a bomb, not an explosive, but something far simpler, a timed ignition disruptor. A sabotage tool that would cause engine failure at altitude without destroying the aircraft outright. A method used in covert operations when subtlety mattered more than spectacle. He lays out a theory that feels almost too calculated to be real. If someone at the Allied base had installed the disruptor under pressure or coercion, it could have gone unnoticed in a rushed pre-flight inspection. Once the plane was airborne and far from help, the disruptor would trigger, cutting engine power gradually. The pilot would experience sputtering, then a stall. With cold winds and limited visibility, the aircraft would lose altitude whether the pilot wanted it to or not. And if the Germans were monitoring the region with their own signals equipment, they might have jammed the plane's radio the moment distress signals began. Another analyst, this one specializing in wartime communications, plays the final radio transmission several times, descending, not by choice. He points out how faint the audio is, how there's an unusual pattern of static on the tail end of the message. He explains that German signal jamming during the war often used narrowband interference which didn't fully block a signal but warped it, fragmenting the waves. The kind of distortion on the tape is consistent with jamming. Not accidental atmospheric noise, not pilot error, an intentional disruption. The idea that the reconnaissance team photographed the outpost and then had their radio jammed isn't just plausible, it now feels likely. But the implications spiral quickly beyond German signal capacity. If the sabotage occurred before takeoff, someone on the Allied side would have had to install the disruptor. The mechanic's old memory, the aircraft carrying unusually heavy camera equipment, becomes important once again. If someone at the base had access to that equipment, it would have been the perfect opportunity to tamper with the aircraft unnoticed. The investigators sift through names of people stationed at the Greenland outpost at the time. Many are long dead. Some records are missing. A few entries in the logbooks have been crossed out entirely, like someone wanted to erase who was present during the final days before the spy plane launched. One historian remarks quietly that the Allied command, even after the war, never fully acknowledged how deeply German intelligence had infiltrated certain northern supply routes. If pressure had been applied to someone isolated, cut off from reinforcements, desperate for news from home, it wouldn't be the first time a wartime traitor emerged under circumstances like these. Meanwhile, the comparison between the spy photos and the German map grows more exact with every layer examined. The alignment isn't just coincidental, the terrain differences match glacier drift over 8 decades. A cartographer overlays the 1943 map onto a modern elevation model and finds that the structures would now be buried beneath nearly 40 meters of ice. One of the antenna towers sits directly under where a minor ice depression is visible on recent satellite imagery, suggesting its collapse and subsequent burial. The resemblance is uncanny. It suggests the installation hadn't been abandoned as early as officially claimed. It may have operated longer, gathering weather and radio intelligence in the Arctic shadows, while both sides publicly pretended the region was too desolate for meaningful surveillance. And that realization leads the team to a darker possibility. If the Germans wanted to keep that outpost hidden at all costs, shooting down the plane would risk drawing attention. But forcing it down without visible attack, using radio jamming or even a tethered weather balloon pulled into the aircraft's path, would create the perfect cover. A crash that appeared to be weather-related. An accident that looked like mechanical failure. Something tragic but unremarkable in the chaos of 1943. Experts begin discussing German cloud balloons, experimental weather and signal devices documented in only a handful of wartime reports. These large, reflective balloons were known to drift near installations to mask radio signatures and confuse Allied reconnaissance pilots. If one of these balloons had been deployed, even intentionally moved into the plane's path, it could have startled the pilot or struck the aircraft, damaging it without leaving explosive residue. Combined with radio jamming and a sabotaged engine, it becomes disturbingly plausible that the Germans orchestrated a precise, coordinated effort to eliminate the reconnaissance flight. As this theory spreads across the investigation camp, the emotional tone shifts from scientific curiosity to something heavier. The story is no longer just about a lost aircraft found under ice. It's about the men aboard, what they saw, what they tried to report, and what forces might have conspired to ensure their discovery never reached Allied command. Family members of the missing officers, now elderly or represented by their children and grandchildren, begin reaching out after seeing media coverage of the wreck. For decades, they lived with what they were told: an accident, bad weather, an aircraft lost to the Arctic void. But now they're hearing about sabotage, radio jamming, German outposts that officially didn't exist. They describe old memories in interviews, letters from the officers that hinted at unease, incomplete details, and unspoken tension about their mission. One woman recalls her father saying, before leaving for Greenland, that the cold wasn't the part he feared. She never understood what he meant until now. As historians compile their findings, the pattern becomes clearer. The Allied outpost logs from the night before the flight contain an entry written hastily, almost scribbled, stating that the flight should depart before weather changes. Meteorologists have reviewed the data. There was no impending storm. Someone wanted them in the air at that exact time. A surviving radio operator, the same one who years ago mentioned a distress signal dismissed for not matching Allied codes, is interviewed again. Now aware of the German outpost's existence, he begins to question what he heard all those decades ago. He recalls the distress signal sounding fragmented, like two overlapping frequencies. Back then, he assumed it was a technical fault. Now he wonders if it was the plane's final attempt to reach the base through thick jamming, its signal warped beyond recognition. The chilling part is his final recollection. He remembers a superior officer walking into the communications room after the distress signal and ordering the logs cleaned up to avoid confusion. At the time, he thought little of it. Now, as the truth emerges piece by piece, he imagines that officer knew far more than he ever said. With each expert analysis, each historical cross-reference, each fragment of memory from those who were there, the narrative shifts. What began as a mysterious disappearance now feels like a convergence of multiple forces: German wartime secrecy, desperate Allied intelligence gathering, covert sabotage by someone embedded in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a silent battle fought in the most remote corner of the Arctic. And as the team prepares to revisit the glacier for deeper drilling near the wreck, one unsettling question hangs over every theory. If a traitor really walked among the Allied personnel in 1943, someone who sabotaged the aircraft under pressure or threat, then that person didn't just disappear like the men on the plane. They lived, they went home, they carried the truth with them for the rest of their life. And the ice, after nearly 80 years of silence, may be about to reveal the last pieces of their story, pieces no one expected to surface after so long in the cold. For months, the investigation circles the wreck site, gathering every possible thread the ice will allow. Teams rotate in and out of the remote glacier, adjusting to brutal winds that can erase footprints in minutes and bury equipment overnight. The plain, once exposed by an unusually warm melt season, is slowly vanishing again beneath drifting curtains of snow, like the land is trying to reclaim what it gave up. But the evidence already recovered, the warped metal, the distressed transmission, the recovered film, begins to form a coherent picture, one that historians, forensic analysts, and surviving family members all feel the weight of. The truth isn't simple, but it's undeniable, and it's nothing like the story told in 1943. The breakthrough comes from the crash analysis team, a small group of aerospace engineers who have spent weeks reconstructing the plane's final minutes from bent rivets, frozen instrument positions, and stress fractures mapped under portable scanners. They determined something surprising. The aircraft did not hit the glacier at full speed. Instead, the landing gear shows partial deployment, and scratch patterns across the fuselage suggest a long, low-impact slide. The team concludes the pilot, despite losing radio contact, despite the sabotaged ignition system, despite whatever the Germans used to disrupt their flight, managed to level the plane before impact. The aircraft came down hard, uncontrolled, and with a failing engine, but not in a catastrophic dive. It means the men on board were alive when the plane touched the ice. The altimeter, frozen mid-descent, supports this. So does the shape of the snow depression around the wreck. The investigators realized the plane coasted down a long, invisible slope buried under snow in 1943, slowing gradually until it came to rest. Then, the Arctic took over. Temperatures that night on the glacier, based on reconstructed climate models, would have plunged far below survivable levels. Exposure would have claimed the officers before dawn. Their bodies, the scientists explain, likely slipped into crevasses over the years as the glacier shifted, pulled downward by gravity and time, until they became part of the deeper ice where no daylight reaches. This revelation is difficult for the families, but there is a quiet reassurance in it too. The officers did not die in the air or in an explosion. They were skilled enough to land their failing aircraft in one of the harshest environments on Earth. They fought until the end. For one historian, this detail feels profoundly meaningful. They completed the mission, he says softly during an interview. They captured the photographs. They made the landing. They held on as long as any human could. The only thing that defeated them was the environment itself. While the crash analysis continues, ice core experts study the layers surrounding the wreck. By drilling narrow, precise columns through the centuries-old strata, they map how the glacier has moved since the 1940s. Their findings explain why the plane eluded discovery for so long. Over nearly 80 years, the glacier migrated downhill, not rapidly, but steadily, carrying the aircraft with it like a relic locked inside a conveyor of frozen time. According to their calculations, the wreck traveled almost 4 kilometers from its original landing site, veering slightly east as wind-scoured ridges redirected the ice flow. Even if search crews in 1943 had walked directly above the future resting place, they would have found nothing but unbroken snow. The lead glaciologist, after reviewing every data point, puts it plainly. This plane didn't just crash, it moved with the Earth for nearly a century. The idea that the glacier hid the wreck so effectively stirs something emotional among the team. It is as if the land itself preserved the evidence until a moment when the truth would matter again. But the biggest piece of truth doesn't come from the wreck or the ice. It arrives in a weathered box found not in Greenland, but in a quiet home in northern Scotland, where the mechanic's grandson has been sorting through his late family's possessions. Inside an old trunk, beneath rusted tools and faded wartime photographs, he uncovers a small diary with thinning pages and a cracked spine. His grandfather's handwriting fills the margins, uneven and hurried in some sections, almost shaky in others. The grandson, aware of the public investigation, contacts the historians immediately. When the diary arrives at the research center, experts gather around it with a mix of dread and anticipation. For decades, stories circulated about the mechanic muttering in his final years that something about the plane had been wrong from the start. Most dismissed it as old age or regret, but the diary changes everything. Inside, tucked between notes on routine maintenance and weather complaints, the historians find entries from the week leading up to the doomed flight. One passage stands out immediately. The mechanic writes that he was approached by a superior officer late at night in the hangar. The officer instructed him to loosen the assembly under no circumstance to be discovered, referring to a component in the ignition system. The phrasing is strange, almost self-contradictory, but investigators interpret it as an order to make a specific part appear intact while secretly undermining its function. The mechanic's tone becomes increasingly distressed as the entries continue. He writes that he questioned the purpose, that he feared the consequences, that he had no choice. His final entry before the crash is the most haunting. He writes that he prayed the weather would ground the flight. The diary, coupled with the sabotage marks found on the engine, leaves no room for alternative explanations. Someone in authority at the Allied base ordered sabotage on an Allied aircraft. No names are mentioned, but the implication is unmistakable. The officer understood the mission's potential to expose the German outpost and feared the consequences, whether because of coercion, misplaced loyalty, or threats no one else knew about. The mechanic, torn between obedience and conscience, carried out the order but was unable to live with it. His diary entries reveal decades of guilt that shadowed him until his death. When this revelation is presented to the families, reactions vary: shock, anger, sorrow, but also a kind of weary relief. For many, the mystery has been a quiet ache for generations. Now, finally, the pieces fit together. The officers didn't vanish due to simple misfortune. They disappeared because their mission was more dangerous, more significant, and more secret than anyone had been told. The military's response is cautious at first, but the combination of the diary, the spy photographs, and the forensic evidence makes denial impossible. A committee is convened. Historians, analysts, and family representatives are invited. After weeks of review, the military issues a formal statement acknowledging sabotage, acknowledging the existence of the German outpost, and acknowledging that the crew of the reconnaissance flight died fulfilling a mission that was intentionally concealed for wartime strategic reasons. The families receive long-delayed honors. Medals that had been drafted but never awarded are finally presented. A memorial plaque listing the crew's names is installed in a museum in Greenland, overlooking the icy coastline where they flew their final mission. Some of the families attend the ceremony in person, braving bitter winds to stand where their relatives once stood. Others watch through streaming video, tears running quietly as they hear the names spoken aloud, some for the first time in an official record. One of the relatives, the granddaughter of one of the intelligence officers, speaks privately with a historian after the ceremony. She says she always felt that her grandfather's story was unfinished, like a chapter missing from her family's history. "Now we know," she whispers. "Now he can rest." As winter deepens, the research camp dismantles its final tents around the wreck site. The last scientific readings are taken. The aircraft, though exposed months earlier, is now nearly buried again. Snow fills its cockpit, softening the once sharp outlines of the wings. The world around it grows silent, the kind of silence only the Arctic can hold, vast and heavy and absolute. The ice won't give back anything more, not this year, maybe not for another century. The investigators gather for one final moment before leaving. They stand beside the plane, partly submerged in a drift, its metal skin frosted white. Some touch the fuselage lightly, as if acknowledging the men who once trusted it with their lives. Others simply watch the snow sweep across the glacier, knowing the wind will finish covering the wreck within days. Before they depart, one of the scientists remarks that the Arctic never keeps its secrets forever. It holds them, protects them, and waits until someone asks the right question. This time, a hiker crossing a lonely stretch of ice had asked that question without even knowing it. As the final helicopter lifts away and the site disappears into a white horizon, the wreck lies still. The last traces of sunlight catch the faded outlines of the RAF roundel before the wind sweeps another layer of snow across it. Slowly, quietly, the plane becomes part of the glacier once more, sealed under the drifting ice. Not lost, not forgotten, just returned to the only place that kept the truth safe long enough for the world to finally hear it.